Okay, well, my mission here is to talk about change across a whole range of physical, cognitive, and personality variables in the 70 to 73 period. Just to say a few words about the early 70s age group. For many, this is a period of quite a bit of stability in their lives with considerable freedom to pursue leisure activities. Most of these people are retired. Most of them are in quite good health. A lot of them have a decent amount of money, and they're able to do pretty much what they'd like. But we have to realize that for these people, the remaining lifespan for the non-smokers is 9 years for males and 16 years for females. And of course, for smokers, it's considerably less than that. They lose about 3 years for people who smoke less than a pack a day, and of course, you lose more if you smoke more than that. About 2% in this age range die each year, and this increases to about 5% by age 80 and to 13% by age 90. So about 18% of the group can be expected to die between age 70 and age 80, and about 40% of the remainder between age 80 and 90, and about 50% of that remainder in the ages between 90 and 95. So what we were hoping in looking at these data is that we would begin to see in the change the people who are really starting to fall off, in order to give us a hint as to which ones might be dying in the coming years between 73 and 76. We had two sessions with the group of participants after the first assessment and after the second assessment, and they were separated by about 3 years. I was lucky enough to attend both of those, and I was really struck in seeing the people come into these sessions. They were very enthusiastic, and the attendance was really phenomenal. I was really impressed that I really did think that they looked older during the second session than they had the first session. I could see the age in them, even though they ranged from people who came in wheelchairs to, at the age 73 one, a woman who ran up the stairs quite late carrying her bike helmet, having just parked her bike downstairs. And it's quite a staircase, and she ran. I wanted to show a few pictures. We don't have any of the same group of people at that session, but the top pictures are from the first session, and the bottom pictures are from the second session. I don't know if you can pick it up from this, but I was impressed in person. And here's another set. The top is from the first, and the bottom is from the second session. Here's some basic statistics on the group. The average age at the first assessment was 69 and a half. And they're very close in age at that first assessment. And second assessment, they're 72 and a half, so it's nicely, very much 3 years later. Originally, there were 548 males and 543 females, and you can see the rest of the statistics about how many returned. One thing I should point out is the fact that there were more males in the first assessment, and the attrition rate was a little higher in females. Does mean that the sample is a little more select for females than it is for males, given that there are more females in the population at this age range. We do have 80 deaths between the first assessment period and June 30th of this most recent year. Of those, 32 were females, 48 were males, and of the 255 that didn't return for the second assessment, 56 or 22% had died. So the death rate, of course, was higher among the people who did not return than it was in the overall sample, which is totally what you would expect. The death rate as a whole was just about exactly what we would have expected. Oops. So I'm considering a whole range of variables here. There are a total of 35 of them, and you can see that there are indications of metabolic function, indicators of physical fitness, body mass index, corrected vision, 3 indicators of reaction time, the number of diseases they report having been diagnosed for, the number of medications that they take on a prescription basis, the hospital anxiety and depression scales, 9 indicators of cognitive function that you've already got quite a bit of detail on, and the 5-factor model of personality. On attrition, among the non-returning participants, they tended to be a little poorer in immune function and inflammation indicators. They were poorer in lung function, walk time, memory span, search speed, logical memory, matrix reasoning, walk design, 3 reaction time measures. In general, the effect sizes were around 1/3 of a standard deviation. But they were also poorer in age 11 IQ, age 70 IQ, years of education, and social class. What that tells you is that a lot of the poorer age 70 performers, among those who didn't return, it really probably reflects some stuff that had been present throughout their lives. And so it's probably typical of most longitudinal samples in these kinds of age ranges, and not some indication per se of greater failing health on their parts, although obviously among the ones who died, that's some health failed there, that's for sure. For whatever it's worth, the people who did not return had retired a little bit earlier than the others, with an effect size of 0.19. They're aging, but not fast and not uniformly. Among the variables that there were no significant differences in, we have immune function, blood clotting, you can see the list there. Quite a few, it's quite a variety of things, both the physical and the cognitive functions are holding up among the variables that did not show either positive or negative changes. We do have some that overall showed decline in function. Lung and kidney function, walk speed, reading and searchability, grip strength were the primary ones of those. But some showed improvements overall. Nutritional status, inflammatory and metabolic markers, and corrected vision. Obviously, you want to talk about corrected vision there. The average directional mean change was a big 0.017, and that was an improvement. Those that showed up for the second assessment and then died differed in the extent of change on these variables only for BMI. They lost on average 0.27 standard deviations of body mass index between time 1 and time 2. And the ones who did come back gained 0.01, or essentially nothing. They were very stable. The average improvement, of course, would improve, and stability would include practice effects where they're relevant to the changes. Those that died did differ at time 1 from those that did not die on immune function, inflammation, forced expiratory volume, which is essentially lung function, 6-meter walk time, search time, the number of prescription medications they took, choice reaction time, block design, the Townsend or activities of daily living scale, all in the expected direction by about 1/2 a standard deviation. So what about individual differences in the rates of change? That's what we were really interested in. Well, the variables are surprisingly normally distributed. The average minimum was a minus 3.48 standard deviations below the mean. The average maximum is almost 4 standard deviations above the mean, so they're pretty evenly distributed around that mean. The average skewness was effectively 0. That does, of course, hide that there are some that are positively skewed and some that are negatively skewed, but not severely. And we were really surprised and a little disappointed because we had hoped that we would see that some were quite positively skewed and some that were, and some quite negatively skewed, with the direction of skew depending on whether an increase or decrease in the variable indicated deterioration in condition. We were hoping that those who were either tailing off on the low end or tailing off on the high end, depending on the direction of skew, were the ones that were likely to give us an indication of real deterioration in condition. These are some of the distributions and what they actually look like. So we have a change in the hospital depression scale in this one. That one was stable, and you can see it's very nicely centered around the mean. The scores, I've set the scores up so that it's time 1 minus time 2. So when the variable is positive, it indicates that there is a decrease in function. And nutrition, which is the variable over here, showed it's a little bit negative, which was a positive improvement in nutritive status. And grip was negative, so it's a little bit positive. And you can see it's just off the mean in the positive direction, not far. So even that was not declining a lot. So are these age changes correlated? Well, we hoped so. But the average correlation is a big 0.045. That's the absolute values of the correlation, so we're not, I don't have any problems with the negative ones canceling the positive ones. Parallel analysis indicates 4 factors in the 35 variables, but most of the variables don't load on these factors. Factor 1 had loadings from logical memory and verbal paired associates, both declines, simple and choice reaction times up, so that would be indicating a deterioration in those functions. Factor 2 was the anxiety and depression scales getting worse, and all of the personality measures also getting worse. For factor 3, we have body mass index and mean arterial pressure, which is a way of summarizing systolic and diastolic blood pressure in a single statistic. And glomerular filtration rate, which is a measure of kidney function. Those were going down, and the nutritive status was going up. And that's a real puzzle, because in this age range, declines in body mass index often indicate that people are really suffering worsening health. Their appetites are giving out, and they don't eat as well anymore. Similarly with blood pressure, when people start to suffer declines in health, their blood pressure falls off. So you often look for increases or stability in blood pressure being an indication of health in old age, despite the fact that at younger ages, increases in BMI and increases in blood pressure are usually signs of emerging problems. So how those factors work out in this age range is not completely clear, because they're right at the cusp where the change is going on and what those variables tend to mean about people's health. With respect to the changes in the personality factors, I read a really interesting paper in which they concluded that people's personalities become more brittle, as they called it, before they start to show declines in cognitive function as they work harder and harder to maintain the cognitive performance that they've been doing. To me, this makes a whole lot of sense, and I think it's really worth pursuing. The measures that they had in this paper were really crummy, and I don't think they had actually demonstrated the effect very well at all. But it seems like it's an idea that is worth following up with some better measures. Well, are these changes meaningful? Out there in the literature, there are some reliable change formulas. What I've got here at the top is the reliable change index, and it's the difference between the two scores divided by the standard error of the difference. To estimate the standard error of the difference, you need to know the reliability of the measures. And this was actually the biggest revelation to me in working with these data, because I have a lot of physiological measures, and medics don't tend to think of reliability the way psychologists do at all. as everybody knows here, I'm sure psychologists tend to think of test-retest reliability as the correlation between one observation and the next observation, or two, reasonably close in time assessments of the same measure. Well, medics look at it as, if we do it again, is it likely to be plus or minus 10%? And that's a typical value for many of their measures, plus or minus 10%. So, and they didn't have any, I talked to people in the lab, and they didn't even have any way to think about what's the correlation between the two measures. So I thought, okay, I can take the data that we have and ask, well, is it, when I get a correlation, say, between two variables of 0.75, or 2 time points of the same variable, what is that in terms of percentages? So I threw in plus or minus a standard deviation. So, if you think in terms of the IQ scale, mean of 100, standard deviation of 15, so that's plus or minus 15%. For personality measures, they're often done on T-scales with a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10, that's plus or minus 20%. Well, you throw in plus or minus a standard deviation, and the correlation is around 0.75. You throw in, is around 0.85. You throw in 2 standard deviations, and it's around 0.75. So psychologists are really, in many ways, kidding themselves about how much stability they actually have in test-retest reliability correlations that we think of as nice and high. The other thing that came out of this was then I wanted to count how many of the 35 changes that I had for each person were actually reliable. And on average, if I assumed that I had, on average, 85% reliability in my measures, 13 of the 35 correlations were reliable, with a standard deviation of 3. The distribution was actually quite normal. If I assumed that I had 75% reliability in my measures, then only 10 of them were reliable. How many were indications of deterioration and how many were improvements? Well, no matter what reliability, about half of them were actually improvements, which could be practice effect, and half of them were indications of deterioration. There was a correlation of minus 0.15, which isn't to say much of anything, between how many of the changes were good and how many of the changes were bad across the individuals. At 85% reliability, and that decreased if you decrease the assumed reliability. So it's kind of a puzzle what's coming out of it. Were the big changers different from the little changers? Oh, actually, I should go back and... among those, there was another surprising thing about the good and bad changes. Those that died after the second assessment had fewer reliable changes than those that survived. Both good and bad. Among the people who had died, there were only about 2 either good or bad reliable changes, and 4 changes in total, compared to the 10 for the people who had survived. Were the big changers different from the little changers? Well, age 11 IQ was the inspiration for getting this study going, or the presence of age 11 IQ. So, age 11 IQ correlated minus 0.18 with total reliable changes. So the people who had more reliable changes had lower IQs at age 11. That's a small correlation, of course. And this was not because the higher IQs weren't declining, though. The correlation was minus 0.19 with good reliable changes, but only minus 0.03, and not even significant, with bad reliable changes. And education and social class generated similar, though slightly smaller, correlations. The total number of reliable changes was associated with increases in the number of prescription drugs they took and in walk time, and decreases in verbal paired associates, learning, logical memory, and search scores. Those that died averaged 99.5 at age 11 IQ, and those that are still alive averaged 95.5, and those that were still alive averaged 100.4, so they were 5 points apart. And that's something that we've reported in other findings, that IQ at age 11 is associated with mortality. Most of the age 70 variables were correlated with the number of reliable changes, but poorer scores indicated more changes, and the correlations were very consistently around 0.13 in absolute value. Again, this was not because the people doing better weren't declining. The correlations were similar with good changes and weaker with bad changes. So it was the good changes that were carrying the weight in the total overall correlation. Why? That was a real puzzle to me. This is only a hint, but the strongest age 70 correlation with the total number of changes was minus 0.24 with conscientiousness. So maybe those people are just a little bit less serious when they go in to take the tests. It's just a hint. What about at age 73? Again, most of the variables correlated with the number of reliable changes, especially the cognitive variables, which were correlated more strongly, about 0.19. But walk time had the highest correlation, minus 0.25. So walk time was going up as number of reliable changes went down. Conscientiousness this time did not stick out, but it did have a negative correlation again. And the bad changes drove the correlations. So this is kind of a look through the rearview mirror, because obviously you can't do anything with this prospectively. Well, we were also interested in, are there any meaningful subgroups in the sample as a whole? One of our PhD students, Andrea Zamet, has been doing a lot of work with the age 70 data, which when she started her work was the only data available. The age 73 data have become available since then. She's done some good work, good substantive work doing latent class analysis, and it has suggested 4 classes based on the cognitive data and 5 classes based on some measures of physical fitness, perceived quality of life, and the HADS anxiety and depression scales. The cognitive classes were, as you might expect, very dimension-like, and basically just sorted the group into 4 layers of overall performance. The social classes also had a lot of evidence of being very dimension-like, but there was an interesting reversal in that there were 2 groups that were, one group was quite high on physical function, but quite low on their assessed quality of life as measured by the HADS anxiety and depression scales, and the other was the opposite. They showed quite poor physical function, but much better feelings about their lives as measured by anxiety and depression. So one question is, are those groups going to hold up at age 73, and can we do anything with the change variables along those same lines? Well, no trace of her classes remains at age 73. I haven't told her this yet. But, the interesting reversal that showed up at age 70, no traces of it left. There were no associations between either kind of class membership and any form of change. Most of the cognitive classes showed significant mean differences in the change in cognitive variables, but the significance and the effect sizes were reduced, and lifetime stability could easily explain those associations. There were also no associations between her class memberships and any of the people who had died. Why? Well, again, this is a little hint. Those two social classes that she found had the lowest IPIP conscientiousness scores. It's just a hint again. I'm almost done. So I went on and did my latent class analysis on the change scores. It yields 3 classes. Should I go on? I don't think so. I doubt it would hold up to age 76 in the slightest. So my conclusions are, in the early 70s, aging is apparent, but so are stability and recovery. Lots of individual differences in change were present, but many of them appear to be noise or just temporary states. Even apparently reliable changes may reflect lack of application during the first assessment. It's the best hint I've got at this point. If there are any leading indicators, they're memory and verbal paired associates and walk speed. A very prominent longitudinal methodology expert named David Ragosa has written, he's written a lot of stuff about the limitations of 2 data points. And one of the things he says is the best thing you should do with 2 data points is start making arrangements to collect the third. And at this point, I can say that I really appreciate that we have the opportunity to go and collect that third data point, and thank Age UK for making that possible. My acknowledgments.
Well, I'm not going to